Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're excited to have ex-Big Law recruiter Sadie Jones here with us to talk about dealing with mistakes, whether in the workplace or in the job application process. Your Law School Toolbox host today is Alison Monahan, and typically I'm with Lee Burgess. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so that you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. Together, we're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. I also run the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can always reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we would love to hear from you. With that, let's get started. Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're excited to have ex-Big Law recruiter Sadie Jones here with us to talk about dealing with mistakes in the workplace and the job application process. So welcome, Sadie.
Thanks for having me back.
My pleasure. I think this will be a fun topic. Well, law students and sometimes lawyers, they like to think that they're perfect, but sadly, that's not true. We make mistakes just like everyone else. So let's talk about how to handle those, whether it's in the job search process or in the workplace. So let's start with the job search context. What are some mistakes that you have commonly seen, or I guess not so commonly, in the job search context?
Well, definitely with your resume typos, which I think we've talked about before.
All the time.
And like weird formatting things, like where the dates don't line up on the right side of it, or there's extra spaces, or something just looks weird, spelled wrong, that kind of thing. And then with the cover letters, like if you address it to the wrong person, you spell their name wrong, you address it to the wrong law firm, I've seen. I worked somewhere where the name of the firm had changed and they were using an outdated name. So you just want to make sure that all of that stuff is correct. You've double checked it. You're sending it to the right person. It doesn't have any mistakes. In terms of just like the basic first level of way that you're introducing yourself.
Yeah, I got yelled at once when I was working as a summer associate for writing someone's name wrong. The client, I think. I drafted a letter and sent it off to the senior associate, and the next day he called me and he said, well, the letter itself is pretty good. However, if it were up to me, I'd fire you because you spelled the client's name wrong. Don't ever do that again. So I think yeah, he was kind of not the nicest person. But I mean, he did have a point, because his point was, we always know how our own name is spelled, and we do notice when people misspell it. And I think the firms or other organizations changing names is really key too, because people don't realize these law firms just kind of switch out their named partners, a lot of them constantly. So you want to make sure that you've actually got that right.
Correct. And also with people's first names, I know yours, for example, can be spelled many different ways.
And people
so you really want to make sure you've looked it up.
Yeah, people misspell my name all the time. For the record, it has one L. It does not have two L's. It has an I. It does not have a Y. It's on the website. It's in my email. You can find it. But yeah, I mean, this is the sort of thing. It seems trivial, but people do notice.
Especially when it's something like that is sort of your intro to people. You just don't want it to, have a mistake. And then beyond that, in interviews, either not having any questions at the end, having inappropriate questions, having looked up more about them than is like publicly available, in a work context. An area which is sort of controversial is thank you notes. And I have seen many mistakes in thank you notes, poor writing, misspelling, weird, referencing things that, went with a different interviewer. And people notice that. I think like just a plain thank you note is sort of a throwaway, but a mistake can be a real red flag. And I've seen it, sabotage a person's offer.
Right, exactly. That's one where you definitely need to get the spelling of the name right. You need to be sure if you reference something that you talked about, that you actually talked about it. There's a lot of, it seems like a simple thing, but there are actually a lot of ways that can go wrong.
And I think the reason people make mistakes is that they probably are sort of writing them quickly and not thinking about them too much. Like, oh, this is just the same thing I've written over and over again. So they don't double check it and proofread it and maybe even have somebody else proofread it. So every part of this is important.
Yeah, I've also seen, weird things that are missing on your resume. Like maybe there's a big gap that you didn't intend to be. Sometimes people leave things off by mistake. Like I've seen law school resumes that didn't have your law school on it because you maybe forgot and sent the wrong one. You also need to make sure your cover letter really matches. So if you have multiple cover letters for different types of positions, you want to make sure that you're not accidentally sending, your 3 paragraphs about public interest work and how you're so dedicated to this to a law firm because they're not going to be impressed.
Absolutely. And everything on your resume needs to be accurate. So even if you're explaining something in a certain way, you can sort of massage your story, but everything needs to be accurate. If you wrote that you graduated from somewhere, you need to have graduated from there. If you wrote that you are fluent in a language, you need to be fluent in that language. And if you wrote that you did something, you worked somewhere, it all needs to be accurate because everything can be checked. So just don't put anything that isn't true.
Yeah, when I was working as a programmer, I always liked to make people do little tests. If they told me, if they're applying for a job and they said, oh, I know HTML. It's like, great. Could you just lay out a table for me real quick? And
right. And they think, oh, it's not about that kind of job, so they're not going to ask me about it, right? Because it's something different. And that's not true.
Right. Well, I just felt like this was a pretty basic task. And if they put that they knew how to do it, they should be able to do it. Eventually, I was not allowed to do that anymore because people felt it was too aggressive. But I'm like, it's on your resume. If you tell me you know this, you ought to know it.
Right. Which is the same if someone just starts speaking in that language. You really need to be prepared to, speak in that language. That could happen.
Yeah. If you put that you're fluent in Hindi, they're probably going to have somebody talk to you who's actually fluent in Hindi and they can check if you really are.
Definitely. So I think that's a mistake that people put without really thinking about it. Like, oh, it's just a little bit of an exaggeration.
Right. I'm kind of fluent.
I think that can be a big deal.
Yeah. I think that's right. You want to make sure that everything on there is accurate. And if it's testable, that, you could live up if given a test on the subject.
Exactly.
Well, what do you think people should do if they're listening to this and they're thinking oh my gosh, I did maybe send off a resume that has something weird on it, or maybe I did get the name wrong of the firm. How can people handle mistakes like this?
Well, I think if it's a resume issue, you can probably fix it and send them a new one. And you don't even necessarily have to say what the thing you changed was. I think it's pretty easy, especially if it just happened, to fix it, to send it off, and to say, oh, here's an updated resume. Could you use this one, when distributing instead of the last one? And I think, if it's a cover letter, you could do something similar. You may want to acknowledge it. I saw there was an error. I wouldn't make a huge deal about anything. I think you sort of have to acknowledge it, fix it, but not dwell on it and make it a bigger deal than it needs to be.
I agree with that. I think fixing the mistake is good, and fixing it in the most kind of innocuous, non-over-the-top way is even better. So, obviously if you have discovered there's a problem, you're feeling probably not great about that, but you don't want to make that kind of someone else's deal or problem. You just want to send them a note that says, hey, I noticed there's a mistake on my resume. Could you please use this version instead? I think that's great language.
I've definitely felt like people are trying to fix something that they feel uncomfortable and then making it sort of my issue to deal with, help them work through it or make them feel better about it.
Oh, don't worry, it's fine.
Not the person's job. Exactly. You're just trying to fix it and move on. And I bet you that they're not going to think much about it unless you make it a big deal.
Yeah, I think you could even say hey, I have an updated resume. I just wanted to make sure you have the most recent version. And
yes,
they're going to be like, okay, great, whatever, throw that in the file,
Absolutely.
Yeah, and the same, if you realize you spelled someone's name wrong in your thank you email, I don't think you send a follow-up email. You just kind of let it go.
Exactly. There are times I was thinking that where, there's just, you don't need to fix it. There's nothing you can really do to fix it. You made a mistake next time, double check their name spelling.
Right. Well, let's talk about that. I mean, because I think even more importantly, obviously no one's perfect, but we do want to minimize the mistakes that we're making. How do you think people can avoid making some of these types of mistakes?
I think have multiple people read all your documents if you can, and have someone maybe do the final read through who hasn't seen it before. I think is a good idea. If you have kind of the same, person, you're working with someone or a parent or a friend or career services, if they've seen it over and over again, I think it's like harder to catch the things like that because they may not be looking for it. So I think having people double check, I think taking each part of the process seriously. Like I said, a thank you note, a cover letter, none of it is a throwaway. And even though someone may never read it, you have to assume that the person is going to read it carefully. And so every piece of it needs to be kind of carefully prepared. And especially if you're doing a lot of, applications in a row, I think you want to make sure you're not in autopilot. I think this is where a lot of mistakes happen, where you're just doing it over and over again. And so then you forget which firm you're sending it to.
Right. I think it's easy when you get in that mail merge mode just to be like, send them all out. But you do actually want to look at this stuff as it's going out the door because this is your reputation. And it may not seem important, but somebody might remember if you say something, offensive or like, your resume is like half the page. Like they might be like, that was weird. What was up with that? You want to make sure you're presenting a good impression.
Yeah. So I think it's just spending the time and the effort and, being careful.
Yeah. I mean, I remember when I was actually sending resumes and cover letters and applications and things in envelopes, I would always make sure I had like the really fancy paper because that kind of forced you to sit there and be like, okay, how is it going in the printer? Like, does it look good when it came out? Did I print it the right way on the page? It just kind of forced you to slow down a bit.
And when each of those is costing money,
I know.
Stamp on it, you're actually more careful.
That paper was so expensive. I spent so much money on like the Crane stationery paper.
Exactly. I think there were things that took more time and effort, and now that they've become easier, I think we can definitely tend to sort of miss things and not be as careful.
Right. I think the other thing, if you're applying online, is you want to make sure you're actually submitting everything they're asking for. So I'm thinking of this even specifically like for clerkships and things. If the judge has asked for something or the firm has asked for something, do they want a writing sample? Like make sure that you've ticked the boxes. And if there's anything else that they want, like sometimes firms might want references or something, you want to make sure that you're giving them what they're asking for. Because in a lot of cases, frankly, that's just kind of a test to see if you follow directions.
Absolutely. Here's another mistake. You can't not include your transcript. So there's no way around them seeing your transcript. They're going to see it. So not including it and making them have to go back to you and ask for it is just annoying. And it's not hiding anything. It's actually making it stand out more. And I've seen a ton of law students do that. Like, oh, maybe they won't notice.
Right. Another one that people try to get away with is they leave off the dates on their resume. And that's just always weird. It's like, you graduated when you graduated. This job lasted however long it lasted. And again, it just kind of draws more attention to the fact that like, well, why did they not do this? What are they trying to hide here? So, I think in a situation like that, if there are things you're concerned about, that's something to talk to someone about at career services or, talk to us about it. But you have to put the dates on there.
You want to make it clear, what your job history and life history was. And if there's a blank, then they are going to see there's a blank. And that's okay. But you can't fudge it.
Yeah. I mean, people are going to notice if you just, don't have any dates on a resume. It's like, okay, that's strange. Let me find out more about that. Or just let me throw this in the pile of stuff I don't really want to deal with right now.
Absolutely. Here's another thing. Some places make you do a background check. Now, it's usually more after you're actually accepting an offer, but, they may even have you fill some things out, HR, forms. That should all be accurate. So even if there's something that you're concerned about or you don't feel good about in your past, like a criminal issue, a credit issue, whatever it is, you can't lie because they're going to find out, and the lie is way worse than whatever you had to explain.
Right. No, that's definitely one of those where you just want to again, very professional, very to the point, but deal with whatever it is and then move on, and don't draw extra attention to it by trying to hide it, because as you said, it will come out.
And let's say that you actually made a mistake, like you realize that you checked something wrong. It's totally fine to tell them, oh, I made a mistake here. I should have checked this box. Again, don't make a big deal about it unless they're asking you more, but just fix it.
Right. You want the record corrected, essentially. So if it ever comes up, you're like, oh, you know what? I did. Like, here's the email where I sent that saying I checked the wrong box. Thanks.
An email, definitely.
Yeah,
like
have a track record. Have a record.
Exactly.
All right. Well, let's switch gears a little bit now and talk about some on-the-job mistakes. What have you seen here?
A lot of things with the document management system. I see a lot of mistakes.
Very true.
I would say that's probably number one. And I'm talking about summer associate, all the way to everyone. So when they give you training on it, pay attention, like learn how it works, learn how to save stuff. And then when you are, working on a case, make sure whatever the file number is or wherever you need to save it, that you understand what security needed to be on it and that it's correct. So it's not like you've locked other people out of it, but also maybe it's not open to everybody. Don't snoop on things that you're not supposed to. They will know. There's a trail of all of that. Don't save stuff locally on your computer. That's the number one thing that really makes people upset. So just understand how the document management system works, even though it's boring, all that orientation stuff. It's probably the most important thing to learn going into it.
I actually completely agree with that. I think it's one of those things people do not pay attention to. And when it is not done correctly, it is absolutely infuriating for everyone who works with you. And people will basically want to kill you or fire you or just cut your head off, because if you're there at 2 a.m. and you know that somebody worked on something and you can't find the document because they saved it locally and then they went to bed and now I'm awake and it's 2 a.m. and I don't have the document I need to work on, I'm not happy about that.
And so ask the questions you need to ask at the beginning whenever you're having the meeting to go over it. Make sure that you're asking these questions, that you are going to need to know later. So, whatever information you need to take down about how it gets saved. So I just want to emphasize that's I think the biggest mistake.
Right. And I think the one thing that goes along with that's kind of related is that you have to make sure if you're in a firm, you're going to be billing your time to someone. So you need to get those billing numbers. And this actually usually relates to the document management system because the documents are saved in a client file. But if you don't have those billing numbers, which seem again kind of not that important, it becomes a huge problem.
And make sure you understand how the billing system works. For example, some firms let you bill travel time or other stuff, to this or to that, or it's billable or it's not billable. Make sure all that stuff that they tell you that you understand so you know that you're doing it correctly. Because that's another thing partners get really upset at. And to go along with that, and your time as you go.
Yeah.
They will call you out. I have seen emails go to an entire firm where they list at the end of the month every lawyer that didn't put in their time, including partners.
Right, because time is money. Literally, this is their money. And if you are not billing this time on a almost daily basis, because what people don't realize is, people are looking throughout the month to see well, how's this month going? Are we using our resources? Do people need more work? Do they have less work? All these things, and you can't do that if people haven't bothered billing their time. Not to mention trying to recreate an entire week or an entire month at the end of it is an absolute nightmare. And I'm a person who hates,
probably not going to be accurate.
No, and I hated billing time, and it was torturous to do. But the more you get behind, the bigger of a mistake it is, basically.
And you can find the system that works best for you. I know some people use timers, some people don't, some people do it, constantly. I just think at the end of the day, you want to make sure that you had your time in for that day. And you definitely, especially when you're starting out, don't want to stand out for not having done it. And summer associates bill their time also. So whether or not they're charging your time, that is not your problem. Your problem is to put everything in accurately.
Right. And to understand what you're supposed to be doing. Part of what people I think don't understand too is oftentimes your report of what you entered will actually go to a client for their sign off. And so if it's, it's much better to have as a line item that I worked on the brief for blah, 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 and discussed, worked on these issues and list them out versus like wrote brief. Like a client's not going to pay for that.
And usually, again, going back to the orientation, usually they'll give you examples. Like there's usually an orientation on timekeeping, and they will tell you like, here's an example of a good timekeeping record. Here's an example of a bad one.
Right.
So you can see exactly how to do it. All that stuff, I just feel like people don't pay attention, and it's actually super useful.
Yeah, they just don't think it's important. And that is the kind of stuff that will drive particularly partners absolutely like up the wall, because they're the ones who are dealing with the clients who are always asking for discounts. And if they can't support the fees, then that's money out of their pocket. And then they are very unhappy.
Absolutely. And to go along with that partner, thing, certain partners like things a certain way. And whatever you can figure out, maybe from the associate or maybe the partner will even tell you. I know they can be weird about like font and spacing and paper clips and all that stuff that may sound silly. But if you're somebody that finds out how the partner likes it and, does it correctly, they are going to remember you as someone who paid attention and made them happy. And that's great if you could start out like that.
Yeah, I had a partner tell me once, like, my job was to make him look good. And I thought that was, like, a little weird, but it is basically true. But, like, he yelled at me in court, basically, like, whisper yelled at me for not having the right, like, staples on the documents. And I'm like, you never told me this. He's like, that's not my job. Your job is to figure out how to do this.
Well, that's why we're giving you all the tips now that you can figure out this stuff because it matters.
Yeah, I mean, you think like, oh, I'm like this highly trained, highly paid lawyer. I would never get chastised over like paper clips or staples, but you do because nobody thought. And my thinking was like, I'm not the paralegal, and the paralegal's like, this is not my problem. Like I'm out doing other stuff, So I think it's one of those things. Like anything you're not sure about, you need to ask and clarify because someone probably has an opinion on it.
And I have a feeling that the partner is just thinking like, oh, well, that's the right way. Like whatever special thing they want is correct and any other way you would do it is wrong. And they're not necessarily thinking like, this is bonkers. Like this doesn't matter because it matters to them. Right.
And they're the ones who are like standing up in court, like passing out those papers and they want them to look good, whatever they think looking good means. And like, you're not clairvoyant. You need to ask these questions. But, things happen. But I do remember getting yelled at over staples versus paper clips or something like that in court in front of a jury.
I've heard a lot of those stories. And so you don't want to be that person.
No, you don't. It's not a great feeling. It's like, how much law school did I do so I could now be chastised over paper clips? Great. Okay. But, a partner once told me about somebody else that they had assigned to make copies. And she was like, the low person on the totem pole. And she completely screwed up the copying job. And he was like, how am I paying this person this much money? And they can't even make copies correctly. And that is also a fair point.
Well, and with copies, sometimes you need that billing number too. I know people that have like charges the wrong thing. And then it's a whole big deal, especially when you're making a lot of copies. So I think a lot of this stuff seems small. But it's just makes you stand out for doing it wrong and makes you stand out in a good way for doing it right and kind of figuring it out.
Right. I think the other thing people don't ever think about is that you need to know how to use some of this like random technology, like a fax machine, for example, because there will come a time if you are like a low level person in a law firm where it will be 2 or 3 in the morning and somebody needs to send a fax internationally and no one knows how to work the machine. And then it's your problem.
Because it may not be just like, usually it's not just you dial in a number. Usually there's like a lot of codes. And
I'm speaking from experience on this one. I have needed to send a fax at 3 in the morning to like Albania where the partner was on vacation and no one knew how to do it. And I was there trying to like, Google how to use the fax machine. I mean, these things happen. But I think, in there, like, you just want to make sure you have resources. So if they're doing an orientation and they're telling you, like, if you ever need to use this, like, here's where the documentation is. That is something to pay attention to.
Exactly. So some of the stuff may not be you need to memorize it and always know how to use it, but at least know where you look it up. Like most firms have a portal, like an internal page where a lot of this stuff can be found. So just, explore that at the beginning and figure out where you can find, answers to things.
Right. I mean, other mistakes I've seen happen, people sometimes are like citing bad cases or making a bad decision about, legal strategy. You're usually not the one making the strategy decision, but I mean, I have seen, higher level people be making terrible decisions. And then it's a question of like, well, how do I tell them I think this is a bad choice? But stuff like citations and like bad case law, that's just something you have to be really careful about, because as the lower level person, you're probably actually going to be the last person who does that check before things go out the door.
Mm-hmm. And it's not going to make you look good, coming in that you couldn't do some basic stuff.
No, and I remember clerking, and there was a case that had been overturned like the week before, and the briefs were submitted after that. And so we got these briefs with like literally bad case law in them. And the judge is just like, did anyone follow this? Because this is not actually the law now. And they're kind of like, oh, yeah, no, we didn't notice that. He's like, yeah, you're going to need to revise this because you don't want to be making this argument with this case right now.
That must have felt embarrassing.
Yeah, well, things happen. I mean, as a clerk, you see a lot of things. I also, one time, there was a case going on, and we had a hearing, and I was looking at the documents, to prepare something for the judge for the next day. And I kind of went in his office at, 6:30 p.m. and was like, I'm not sure there's subject matter jurisdiction in this case. And he was like, that's interesting. No, I think you're right, actually. So we go in the next day, and he kind of asked the lawyers, and they say, oh, we're willing to waive that. And he's like, yeah, that's not the way this works in federal court. You need to go back to state court. So things happen. I mean, how embarrassing.
I think you don't want to be that person that made that mistake.
No, and there's certain like case law things that people always screw up. Like I remember this summer, another summer, like massively screwed up like a choice of law issue because like they forgot about the Erie doctrine. And this is stuff from like first year civil procedure that you probably didn't think was that important, but it is really important in reality because you got to get the law right.
Yeah. I think that's a lot of the theme of this is things you don't think are important that turns out that they are.
Right.
Like all the little things.
Yeah, because they become big things when you get them wrong.
Exactly. Another thing is, I think, understanding like when you need to be there, when you need to leave, kind of what's expected of you. Is there like, if it's not COVID times, is there sort of a FaceTime requirement or does it not matter? Try to understand what that is, because if someone's looking for you and you're supposed to be there and you're like, in a spin class, that's not going to look good.
Yeah.
Which is something that happened, that my entire summer class decided to go to an exercise class instead of come to a training because they thought it was optional.
Not that you remember that.
RSVP'd. Yeah. They really all got a talking to. So, if you say you're going to go something, do it. That's important.
No, I think that's absolutely true. And, when you're in person, I think this is actually an underutilized way to use your secretary, because your secretary will basically cover for you if you're on good terms with them, but you have to tell them, so if you are going to go to that spin class, you probably want to like duck out and tell your secretary like, hey, I've got a really important meeting I've got to take off site. I'll be back in an hour. If anybody's looking for me, like I'll be back then. That's way better than like, where in the world is Alison? Like, I need her right now. No one knows where she is. We can't contact her. So the secretary is there to be like, oh, you know what? She had to step out for an hour. She'll be back. That's fine. Nobody cares about that.
Absolutely. And when you're a summer associate, I think, not as much generally is expected of you. So you at least need to be there. When it is in person. It's just like, I think they expect the basics because, it's not that long of a time. You're not asked to work as much as, a junior associate. So I think they do expect that sort of at the very least.
Oh, and I've heard of firms where their secretary was literally required to basically like check people in and check them out, So if you're at that too. Yeah, if you're at that place, then like somebody's going to be watching. So you need to like be on good terms with them.
And every place is different. That's why I said I think it's a good idea to kind of like understand, like maybe you talk to your mentor, you go out to lunch with some junior associates, but these are questions to ask, what kind of place is it in terms of that and what's expected, because you just don't want to stand out. On the other hand, I've seen summers kind of stay too late. People are concerned about them, like they're working too hard and they're trying to kind of overdo it. And somehow that doesn't look good either. So I know there's kind of a medium.
I think it's a balance. And this also, again, depends on the partner. Like some are morning people, some are night people. You need to find out if you're working for someone who wants to start working at 7 a.m., you might have a different schedule than if you're working for someone who never comes in before 11. And both of those people exist.
Absolutely. So I think it's, it may be, sort of a general firm thing. It may be, the specific person you're working with, but you want to be clear on what those expectations are, because you don't want to be like somebody's looking for you, they don't know where you are, and you're missing.
Yeah, because then they just get anxious and angry, and that's just never a good state for someone to be in when they find you.
Exactly. And also, you have email on your phone, they're expecting you to check it. You're not just being a lawyer, you don't get to leave at 5 or 6 and then you're done, and you don't have to look again. It's just not that kind of job.
Yeah, unfortunately so. All right, before we wrap up, let's switch gears a little bit. What if somebody's being blamed for something that's not actually their fault at work? I've seen this happen a number of times with junior associates. So they don't really make the mistake, but they're the ones who ultimately get blamed for it. Is there anything people can do about this?
This is such a sticky situation.
It is.
And I think it could depend on the details of what the issue was. Generally, it's not a good idea to throw someone else under the bus, right? But you also don't necessarily want to say you did something. So my advice would be to kind of focus on what the solution is to the problem rather than who did it. So you understand this happened. What can you do to help fix it? So I think there's a way to not directly take responsibility for something that's not yours, but maybe take responsibility for the solution, and then they'll remember you for that.
That's good advice. I mean, I think this is super sticky because on the one hand, if you have proof that you didn't actually submit this document and your version was good, there's a very strong temptation to get that proof out there. And sometimes I think that can make sense depending on the scenario. But I think you do have to be very cognizant of making the person who's above you in the chain angrier by the fact that now it's clear that it wasn't your fault and it's really their fault. This is kind of a no-win situation, basically, unfortunately.
And there might be situations where you didn't make the mistake, but maybe you should have seen it. Right. You did make the mistake. So I think there are a lot of situations where you probably were at fault somewhere, in there, and maybe everyone is, because a lot of people looked at it and didn't see it.
Right.
I just feel like focusing on blame is never kind of the most mature way to deal with it. And no one really wants to hear that.
That's true. And I think if this happens repeatedly, it's probably a sign you need to get a different job, frankly, or at least stop working if you can from the person that you're working with, because there's some people who just do this and you do not want to be working for those people.
And I mean, I think that a good partner always takes responsibility ultimately for whatever the work is. I know that not everyone does that, but the partners that I've worked with were really great. Always feel like they should have looked at everything in the end, and it is kind of their issue. And so hopefully they're not focused on the blame, because they're in charge. And I just think that's a good message to kind of send down the line. Hey, I was the one who was responsible for this, but you guys have to make me look good.
Right. And I think it's the same thing. If your secretary or paralegal does something and they don't do it correctly, ultimately that's your problem. You should have looked at that.
Please don't blame your secretary for you can work with them on whatever the issue was later, but that looks really terrible if you blame the secretary or paralegal to the higher ups.
No, that would definitely be a mistake, because they are not going to be amused by that, because a lot of these people have been there way longer than you have, and also it's just really bad form because you were the one who was admitted to the bar, you were the one who was signing off on this, and if they screwed something up, it's on you, it's not on them.
Yeah, and hopefully you learn something. Next time I should have checked whatever it was. So yeah, that is definitely the hardest situation, though.
Yeah, I think so. All right. Well, unfortunately, we're running out of time here. Any final thoughts you want to share?
Go slow and think about everything that you're doing carefully. And so, you don't want to get too caught up with not making a mistake that you're paralyzed, right? but you want to feel like you were careful and that if you made a mistake, you were doing your absolute best and you're going to fix it and not make that mistake again. You know, that's what I would say. But I think just kind of being careful and like really calculated about everything you're doing is helpful.
I agree. I think you want to have kind of a defensible process. And then if mistakes slip through, then occasionally they happen. But, you know, you always, for example, want to be double checking the names of people, as we talked about. For your citations, you want to have a process for the citations to make sure that they're going to be as correct as possible. And if you do, then when somebody comes back to you and they say, oh, there's this problem, then either you've got to figure out what went wrong in the process, or, you know, at least can explain to them, well, like, look, here's how I tried to make sure that didn't happen. And, you know, hopefully people recognize that sometimes things happen. It's just, that's life.
And just, you don't want to have made the same mistake twice.
Right.
I think is a big thing. Like that you've learned something, you've moved on, it's not going to happen again.
No, that's a great point. You want to, if you have made a mistake, you want to be sure that you're like, you can explain how next time your process is changing so that this would not happen again, because if it does happen again, it looks a lot worse.
Exactly.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. For more career help and the opportunity to work one-on-one with us, you can check out careerdicta.com. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We would really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to Lee or Alison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com. That has one L in it. Or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.